questions in this webinar series, and we want you to go away feeling that you've learned something. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm coming at you live from the heart of the EU Quarter. Now, we'll start today, this series, with a webinar dedicated to talking about a possible liquid fuel strategy for the EU. What would be the benefits, the drawbacks, and why is it or is it not needed? Now, the questions we'll be delving into today, we'll be talking about why such a strategy might be needed. Would it provide more clarity for the industry? Could it answer some of the hard questions that are being posed around sustainability? And what would be the impact on affordable transport and access to mobility? What about social cohesion? How do we make sure that climate policy doesn't put the financial burden on the people who are least able to afford it? The European Commission, in its communication on a sustainable and smart mobility strategy in December 2020, also showed increased attention to these fuels by announcing its intention to launch a renewable and low-carbon liquid fuels value chain alliance. New liquid fuels value chains are appearing, and new industrial opportunities are emerging. So how do we grab hold of those opportunities? To answer that question, I'm going to bring in our panel. Let me introduce them to you now. First, we have John Cooper, Director General for Fuels Europe. He's been Director General since April 2015. John started his career in the motor industry working on future powertrains, and after 3 years, he moved to BP Downstream, where he has 27 years of experience. Then we have Luis Cabra, Deputy CEO of Repsol. He's also the Executive Managing Director of Technology Development, Resources and Sustainability, and a member of Repsol's Executive Committee. He joined Repsol in 1984. And finally, we have Andreas Gluck, German member of the European Parliament. He's a specialist in surgery and a politician from the German Free Democratic Party, the FDP. He was a member of the State Parliament of Baden-Württemberg from 2011 to 2019, and in 2019, he was elected as a member of the European Parliament. Gentlemen, all welcome, and thanks so much for being here with us today. I have a few introductory questions for you guys, and then everybody watching at home, you're going to be able to ask your questions to the panelists as well. You can see a space for doing that right next to the screen that you're watching it on. When you have those questions come in, I'm going to see them, and then I can ask those questions that you pose to the panelists toward the end of the panel. You can go ahead and start submitting your questions now if you already have a question that you're dying to have answered. Otherwise, if somebody says something during their introductory remarks or during the conversation, feel free to obviously respond with a question. So, John, let me start with you. Why do you think we need a liquid fuel strategy?
So thank you, Dave. Well, I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that today almost everything that moves in Europe moves with liquid fuels, with the exception, of course, with electric trains and also an increasing number of electric cars. Now, of course, we know that there are really important technologies coming forward. Electrification of vehicles is really advancing very fast, and also the role of hydrogen. And as an industry, we really do understand that these will play a very significant role and reduce the need for liquid fuels and petroleum fuels in the future. But it's also worth reflecting of the fact that all of the equipment that has been bought over the last year or two, whether it's cars, trucks, aircraft, or ships, at least 90% of that is designed to work on a liquid fuel. And that equipment usually has a life of anything between 20 and 40 or even 50 years in some cases. And so there'll be demand for liquid fuels for a long time. We also know that liquid fuels are simply the best form of energy storage and delivery for many forms of transport. The outstanding energy density, stability, transferability is just unrivaled. And so we see that there will be a role in some parts of transport in the long run, and most certainly in the transition as well. And we also see at the moment that the way liquid fuels are treated, both petroleum-based and renewable fuels, are treated in quite a piecemeal way, not really joined up in regulation. And we think perhaps there is something missing here in terms of the way a vision for the longer term works together. We think that having a strategy that actually links together the pieces of regulation would help give investors confidence and customers a better understanding of how renewable liquid fuels in the future can be part of the solution, and that how businesses and citizens could be involved with that. We just need a better conversation and a joined up mindset, and that's what we call a strategy.
John, let me push back on you a bit. You know, one of the criticisms we hear when this idea is thrown out there from NGOs is that this is perhaps just an attempt to defer electrification, that it's trying to move things away from that direction. How do you respond to that idea?
I'd say not at all. Just look at what the industry is doing across Europe. The membership of Fuels Europe are very actively involved in advancing electrification. And that makes perfect sense because it is for sure a major part of the solution. So many of the members are investing heavily in electric vehicle charging infrastructure and facilities, and also in deploying generation of renewable electricity, wind and solar, for example. And even one of the members is a major member of the European Battery Alliance. As an industry, we understand the technology and science and know that electricity is part of it, but we also see the limitations. They have to go hand in hand. Liquid fuels together with electrification and hydrogen solutions, they will be complementary. That's our vision.
Luis, we heard there from John the type of investment that's needed. What do you need to make that investment? What type of signals does Repsol need to make this type of investment? And would a strategy give you that type of signal?
Well, thank you very much, David. And well, to answer your question, let me start by saying that why the energy mix of the future needs to be so different from today. And the reason you all know is carbon dioxide and the need of decarbonizing the energy mix. So starting from that point and from the energy mix we have today, it's evident for companies like Repsol that we are making today a business basically on putting in place the energy that the world needs, which is based on oil and gas. We need to transition to the new forms of energy. And this is the way that we are doing. We are of the vision of moving from, let's say, oil and gas to a full set of energy services, which is based on a number of considerations about technology options we have for the future. On one side, we have a very intensive electrification based on renewable energy, and that's why Repsol decided to move into that new business too. And then second, because electrification cannot reach all the uses, we need low carbon fuels, both liquids and gases that can play a role in decarbonization. And then we have the low carbon fuels. Even on top of that, because the addition of electrification and low carbon fuels may not be enough, then we have other possibilities around carbon sinks, whatever is carbon capture, use and storage, or even natural climate solutions. This is our view, and we are applying all the technology options into our new strategy. And I believe that the decision, every company will be different, but here the business activity needs to do with risk-taking. And I believe this is the thing that companies should be required to do. Risking in new business, in legacy business, going towards the level of decarbonization which is required by the current and future regulation. So your question was about investments, and I would tend to give a different answer every time I'm speaking about investments, because many people, they say, okay, these are new technologies, uncertain technologies, I need support. And support many times means subsidies, public aids, etc., etc. I would think in a different way. We should be embracing risk-taking. every company will not be the same. Repsol may bet for certain technologies, others may bet for certain technologies. So a healthy environment for investment would be a type of regulation that open doors and not close doors. Any door which is open is an opportunity for decarbonization. So let's leave all the technologies to compete and even to complement, because at the end of the day, the challenge of climate is so big that we need many alternative options. Some of them will be successful in the future, and some of them may fall during the way. So opening doors rather than selecting the technologies first and then having public support to specific technologies. I believe this is, for me, we can elaborate a little bit more later, but definitely this is the type of regulations that we tend to favor.
Andreas, so we've heard there from Luis about what he needs from a business perspective. How can policymakers help turn that into a reality, turn that into concrete investment? Okay, so let's go a little bit more into the same reasoning. There's a question for Andreas, in fact. Sorry, excuse me, Andreas. Andreas, how can policymakers help?
No problem, Luis. In a lot of things, I will support you. So first of all, hello. I hope you all have a good day. So first of all, I want to say that a lot of politicians right now are talking about electric mobility, and I believe this is good. I believe that it is good that we have electric mobility in our minds, but it is not good if electric mobility is pretty much the only thing politicians talk about. What we have to look for is for a level playing field. And if we have a level playing field, then of course also people know that there is a certain security if you invest money in other branches than, for example, electric mobility. So it is, I mean, we are working on a pathway for sustainable transport. And I really believe that electric mobility can contribute at least a little bit, but I don't believe that it's the one technology for all. And to be very clear in this point, I believe that not politicians are the specialists when it comes to all the different kinds of technologies. I believe that we should go for a framework, for a fair framework, for a level playing field, and we should not do any attempt to kick out any technology at the moment, because it could be that this technology can be important for the future. What we have to discuss also, I mean, you know, electric mobility, for efficiency principle, electric mobility is pretty good, but efficiency first principle is not the only thing. We also have to talk about security of supply, for example. We have to talk about storage, for example. We have to talk about energy density when it comes to aviation, or when it comes for long road transport, for example. And so also when it comes to the combustion engine, my personal belief is a combustion engine is neither good nor bad. It just depends on what you burn in it. And this is the reason why I believe we should open our eyes a lot more when it comes to synthetic fuels, to synthetic liquid fuels, also to other things. So, for example, hydrogen. So I believe this will play an important role. So is it now good that is a European strategy now the real tool when it comes from the European Union? And I say yes and no. On one hand, we need a strategy. Yes, this is true. On the other hand, strategy very often means subsidies, it means quotas, and it means a very, very detailed regulation. I don't believe we need that at the moment. I believe it is better to enable a framework conditions for alternative fuels and for alternative fuel market. So I believe ETS expansion to transport would be a really, really important thing to do. I also see that we have to work on our renewable energy directive on the RED II. We have to go for a level playing field there. I also believe we should not only take a look at the tailpipe of a car, for example, but we should go for a life cycle assessment, a life cycle framework. This would be really, really important. And of course, we as European Union, with the European Green Deal, on one hand, it's a huge risk. On the other hand, it is also a huge chance, because if you really do research on this, And if we are the leading continent when it comes to all those new technologies, and as I said, I'm a politician, I can't tell you which will be the technologies. I can just say we shouldn't kick out any technologies. We should go for a framework, and then the best technologies will make the race. And if we do that, and if we support research, for example, and if we maybe take a look at our SMEs, because let's not forget, it's not the huge companies which are in direct contact with the customer. Very often it's the smaller enterprises. It's really the SMEs we should not forget about. And if we do that right, I believe that the Green Deal can be a huge chance for the European Union.
Thanks a lot. John, I wanted to get some clarification from you because you talk about low carbon liquid fuels. Why not talk about zero carbon fuels? What is the distinction there?
Well, low carbon refers to a range of technologies that we can see that can produce fuels with biogenic and captured carbon. And those include sustainable biomass feedstock, advanced biofuels technologies, captured carbon, wastes, residues of a wide variety. And so the actual carbon that's in there can be captured or biogenic. In the early days, at least, we would expect some process emissions to do with collection of biomass, for example, or production. But there is a pathway, actually, for many of these fuels to get to the point where they could be climate neutral. And in some cases, even beyond climate neutral, to be actually sort of capturing and storing carbon through, for example, biomass with carbon capture and storage at production sites. So it's a general term. We also recognize that because liquid fuels are so flexible, the way these could be used for some years would likely be mixed with the existing petroleum production, lowering the carbon content. So it's an overarching term that describes a series of low carbon technologies that absolutely have the potential to be climate neutral by 2050 and at scale as well.
Andreas, what's your take on that about what John's just outlined there? I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, sure. I would basically agree on that. I mean, probably there has never been a technology which was new and like everything switched like in a moment. What we need is a transitional period, and because of that, I believe, as I said, we should go for a good framework, and a good framework for me means the ETS because you know that you're just supposed, to go for less CO2 every single year. So this would be a very good thing. And I mean, of course, we need a transitional period from my point of view. So I can really agree on that. The problem is maybe if I can put it that way, as you know, I'm from Germany, and maybe we see the problem, maybe kind of a little bit of what has been mentioned already before. If I talk to some of my colleagues coming from other countries, of course, sometimes they really have completely different opinions. So a lot of them want to simply ban the combustion engine, and they're just fighting about when they want to do it. If they want to do it in 2030, 2035, or 2040. I believe we shouldn't do it at all. I believe we shouldn't ban a certain technology. I believe, as I said, we should take a look what fuels we put in our combustion engines. And if the combustion engines will make the race, and the goal is that it's not only low carbon, but it's zero carbon, of course, transitional period, but the goal has to be a zero carbon emission car, also with liquid fuels. And if this is technologically possible, and if they can participate, they're in the race, and it's good. And if they're not, then they're not. But we shouldn't kick them out in first place before we know if maybe also liquid fuels and combustion engines can contribute.
Luis, I wanted to ask you from a business perspective. I think whenever we have debates about this here in Brussels, people remember the experience with biofuels and the EU regulatory framework for biofuels, which was not very predictable, to say the least. And my experience is that kind of haunts people still today. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what What does that experience with biofuels policy in the EU, how does that shape how you're thinking about liquid fuels policy going forward from the EU? What was your takeaway from that period with the biofuels back and forth?
Well, the benefit of getting old is that you may have the experience of looking back and see which were the good decisions and maybe the bad decisions that were taken in the past. Definitely from the first, I would say, generation of biofuels, I believe that we have all learned that we cannot develop massively biofuels that are for which the raw material comes to compete with other uses, specifically food uses, etc. So I believe that the European Union legislation is addressing that very well and is pointing out very clearly that for the future, there is not much more room for first generation biofuels. You may still produce first generation biofuels with due certifications and so on, but the future is going to be out of a different type of biomass, residual biomass based on principle of circular economy and so on. So, but we could say the same for other experiences that we had in the past. Again, we had a first wave of hydrogen back at the late last century, at the beginning of this century. At that time, hydrogen was assumed to be the solution for the future of energy everywhere. And this failed again. Probably the vision was not that bad, that hydrogen can play a role for the future as a key element of decarbonization, but at that time was going to be just the hydrogen economy was what was at that time claimed. So I believe that we should learn from the past and we should look forward. And probably the main lesson from the past is do not bet to specific technologies. Leave the doors open to all options because some of them will not progress as we may expect. Who would be saying 20 years ago or 30 years ago that we were going to be today with digital technologies, etc. So the future is not written. So let's be the single ambition and the single obsession should be decarbonization.
John, what's your take on this? I mean, do you also get the impression that that lack of predictability, that uncertainty with biofuels for so many years still haunts the industry here? And do you think that a liquid fuel strategy could help alleviate that? You're on mute, John?
There's no doubt that in the early days of biofuels in the EU, the many changes around the regulations have been harmful. Looking back, we can see what is important is to have a well thought out strategy for sustainability of biofuels and biomass, and for governments to decide and set that and to try and keep it constant for as long as possible. Because investing in biomass production and collection means making a commitment for a longer term. And actually, the real growth potential we've got in providing biomass into energy is in lower quality wastes and residues, co-products from food production, or from forestry, etc., wheat straw, waste wood, a number of different sources. But the challenge with taking those wastes is that the production of energy and fuels from those is capital intensive, which means you need a longer period to cover the cost of your capital and your investment, which means you need to make a financial plan for a longer period, 10 years or more. And so you need to know what policies apply. And if the policies keep changing, you've got a real risk when you're making that financial plan. If the policies keep changing, it discourages you from making the investment in the first place or developing the technology longer. And so it really is key that we get stable regulation that gives us a longer wavelength over which to develop the technologies, to recover the capital, to keep the costs reasonable to the end consumer, and to build the scale of the industry. And so it's all linked to that request for let's have a strategy that has got a long wavelength gets us to a really ambitious destination.
Andreas, that biofuels period far predates your entry into the European Parliament, but do you think that EU policymakers have some culpability for that uncertainty that plagued this area for so long? And what can be done now, lessons learned from that, what can be done now to give people more certainty?
The problem I see at the moment, and this is why I have a lot of fights in the European Parliament. There are some politicians who really want to decide which is a good technology, which is a bad technology. And I mean, when it comes, you know, and they kind of do as if liquid fuels and fossil fuels are the same. And this is not true. We know that. But you know, some of my colleagues, they want to act as if they know what's good and what's wrong. And I believe that we shouldn't leave one path. And I'm so sorry that today nobody's here from the Commission, because I would have loved to tell them as well. I believe something historical took place during the last couple of months. It was always the Commission which went for technological neutrality, and I believe this was good. But right now, when I hear banning a certain technology, the technology itself, not the fuel, the technology itself should be banned, then I believe that we leave the path of technological neutrality. So what I try to do is I try to convince my colleagues that we have to be reliable. We have to be reliable for customers. We have to be reliable for companies. And the best way to be reliable is that you go for a certain framework. I always have a little bit of a problem if we go for something we call a strategy. It sounds really, really good, but usually strategies on European level, they you know, it's kind of similar to subsidies, for example. I believe this is not the way we should go too much. I believe we should go for a framework where you can rely on that this framework is still valid in 1, 2, or 10 years, or 20 years even, or all the way up to 2050. And so I believe that the proposal of an expansion of the ETS to the traffic sector would be a good thing, because then everybody kind of knows the path in the future. That CO2 emission is getting more expensive, and that we have to look for a CO2 neutral in the best way, or low CO2 fuels for the future time. So I believe the best thing we as politicians could do, and this is what I try to convince my colleagues as well, the best thing what we could do, that we don't focus on certain technologies, but we keep a technological neutrality. And as I said, that we go for a framework which is reliable, which is predictable for everybody.
I want to move on to the issue of taxonomy, because that's the really hot, one of the really hot regulatory issues right now in the EU, where they're coming up with this list, this taxonomy list for what could be eligible for sustainable finance. But of course, that list is going to have an impact throughout policies, because it's basically going to define what is a green technology and what is not, and so what can therefore be eligible for funding. It does, on its face, sound like the opposite of technology neutrality, but I'm curious to get your takes on this. I mean, we have heard strong calls for the exclusion of bioenergy and the forestry sector from that taxonomy list. So how important is that taxonomy list going to be in terms of setting investment expectations? John, I'll put that question to you first.
I think that so this subject is really important, because getting it right for sure brings money into the sector, support for research and development, and scaling up the technologies. We only have to look at what's happened in recent months around company valuations in the electric vehicle sector. And that's very clearly because there's now a strong consensus that that's part of the future. And actually, some people have used the word bubble for that sector. A bubble isn't necessarily healthy, but it would be nice to have a little bit of that around other technologies too, and to spread out the investment so that the risk is lower for society and the opportunities are greater for citizens to have different choices. So yes, it really is important to get right. The exclusion of biomass, for example, we think is a little strange. Actually, the work that the Commission has done shows that actually in their plans, there's a big increase in the use of biomass to reach climate neutrality, but mainly for the power sector. And we think it's not necessarily the case to make that assumption that it should all go into the power sector. Some of that can go into liquid fuels. We also know that from the Commission's own work, the biomass is available. The European Commission JRC has been the basis of our own work. And if we look at the technologies outside of Europe and the availability of biomass, many parts of the world have huge resources of biomass. So it's quite a good place to be good at those technologies if you want to be a leader globally in climate action.
Luis, same question to you. How important is this taxonomy outcome going to be to investment decisions?
It's very important that the finance community is today a little bit disoriented and a little bit confused about what they should do to align with the climate ambitions. And they are very clearly, our investors, they are clearly asking us about, okay, explain to me your strategy, provide a framework, provide methodologies, provide some homogenization of this type of thing. So taxonomy will be important. Europe has taken the lead, which is very good. But if you want me to say which are the aspects that I would believe that could be improved in the existing taxonomy proposal, on one side is, again, inclusiveness. I mean, everything that contributes to CO2 reduction should be considered as in the taxonomy. Well, the European Commission says, okay, the list cannot go so exhaustive. This is just an orientation, but this is going to be important. So basically, I should say that there is still some lack of inclusiveness of solutions that help us to decarbonize the system. And again, this is about technology neutrality, as Andreas said, again, because the key principles apply everywhere. On the other side, consistency is also important. John mentioned about the biomass. There should be more consistency between what the taxonomy says and what, for instance, the Renewable Energy Directive 2 says. And this consistency is important, speaking about, let's say, predictability and having a stable horizon for investment. And finally, and probably this is a second type of improvement, maybe a little bit less of priority, but it's also important, which is avoid complexity. I mean, the reporting elements of the taxonomy are very hard, are very heavy, I would say. They are speaking about, for anything you do, you need to provide information about your revenue, your CapEx, your OpEx, with a lot of granularity. Of course, having transparency is important, but we have heard, for instance, I heard the Mr. Kerry from the States saying, maybe the States will go not exactly into the taxonomy as the European way. We are simpler, we are more pragmatic, we are a little bit more agile. So I would put also that for a company, this is also very important. Avoid unnecessary complexity and avoid overlapping with other regulations, because the taxonomy, it's also in the reporting asking companies to provide objectives. And then we are messing the list of taxonomy activities with reporting, with setting objectives. For me, it's too complicated, but I believe there is still time to discuss that. And don't look at me very defensive and very negative. I believe the taxonomy is absolutely necessary because the financing community is asking for clarity about what is ESG compatible, which is climate compatible, etc.
Andreas, this taxonomy issue will be something that EU lawmakers need to sort out. So what are you most keenly watching for in this whole taxonomy exercise?
So first of all, I have to say that I'm not a friend of the green taxonomy at all, because I saw the risk from the beginning on. This is also the reason why I voted against. When the term green taxonomy was raised for the first time, everybody said, it's just for orientation, this is not really so important. It's just, no problem. It's just a tool, it's kind of like a tiger without any teeth. And what really disturbs me the most is the fact that it was introduced as something, and now it is something completely different. Now it has teeth. Now it is misused as a political playing ball, which technologies you can put in the green taxonomy and which you don't. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of discussion, and maybe sometimes it depends on from which member states my colleagues come from. So very often we have own interests, and so now the green taxonomy is some sort of a playing ball. As I said, I don't like the green taxonomy. I believe it is too complicated. I don't really, as I said, let's go for a real framework. Then we don't have to go for a taxonomy, because, for example, if we would have an ETS or different ETS in every energy sector, then a green taxonomy wouldn't be needed anyways, because everybody would know that CO2 emissions will get more expensive and more expensive over the years. So I'm not a friend of it at all, but of course I have to deal with it. And all I can do is that I try that the green taxonomy is not misused as a political playing ball. And this is what Luis Capra said before. I think we should decide. I mean, as I said, I don't like the green taxonomy, but now we have to deal with it. And if you want to deal with it, I believe the best way would be that we only decide what is good for CO2 emission reduction can be in, and everything else has to be out. This should be the definition.
Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is some serious skepticism about what a liquid fuel strategy would be for, what its purpose is, and whether we should really be encouraging liquid fuels. I know that Transport and Environment, T&E, put out a briefing early this month basically concluding that e-fuels don't make sense for road transport. So John, I wanted to ask you, if you've seen this report, how do you respond to those types of suspicions, that type of skepticism?
So thanks, Dave. So it's absolutely fair to dig into the details of this, and I respect that T&E want to have some scrutiny over this. But our look at that work shows that it doesn't really fully add up. First of all, there's a claim about the carbon savings are nowhere near what they should be for e-fuels. From what we can see, the study that they have done has been based on using today's electricity, which of course has got some, a carbon footprint. And some of the electricity is from gas or coal. And so really, does it make sense to even think about making electricity from gas and coal and then using the electricity to make e-fuels? It really doesn't. You would never consider making e-fuels that way. So we think, that part of their work is kind of redundant and misleading. They make clear points around costs, and it is true that in the short term, e-fuels will have higher costs, very significantly higher costs. E-fuels are all about the longer term potential. We know that renewable electricity is getting lower in cost, but part of the problem of building bigger and bigger wind and solar installations is that you end up further away and with a bigger variability problem than you have with the current grid. And hydrogen strategy is part of responding to that, and e-fuels is part of it as well. As electricity costs come down, e-fuels will make a lot more sense. We also make the point that the strategy for liquid fuels should include road transport. And it's really one of the, it's picking up one of the points that they're making, that e-fuels will be more expensive for aviation. They are promoting or supporting e-fuels for aviation, yet but they also admit that the costs are high. So we're saying actually the best place to scale up those technologies is in the road transport sector, where you've got policy tools like taxation, like the Renewable Energy Directive, and very strong carbon pricing signals from vehicle regulation. You can use those to build an e-fuels industry And then later, if we are successful in having electrification in all road transport, those fuels are available for aviation and maritime later at bigger scale. So this is actually what we mean by a strategy here.
Andreas, what's your response to this idea that e-fuels don't make sense for road transport?
So first of all, I'm a medical doctor and I'm an MVP, so I can't tell. I don't know. But because I don't know, I believe it doesn't make sense to kick it out of the race already today. Let's give it a chance. This is my political opinion, and my personal opinion is, sometimes it doesn't make sense to use a certain technology in only one sector and not to use it in another sector, because we have to generate scale effects. We have to have some sectors, and if they go well, then probably related sectors will also make sense. So I believe that this could be really important, that we include liquid alternative fuels also for the future, also in road transport. The further, I believe, everybody's talking about new cars, but what about the existing fleet? What will happen there? I mean, from a ecological point of view, it doesn't make sense when people buy new cars like every 2 years. I mean, as a German, this makes us a bit happy at the moment still, yeah, selling a lot of cars. But anyways, from an ecological point of view, from a CO2 emission point of view, it's maybe not good. So we should accept that there is an existing fleet, and so liquid fuels can really make sense. And the third point is, if we talk about electricity costs today, there is no electricity cost. It is changing through the day. So, for example, as you know, in Germany, we have a lot of renewable and of renewable capacities installed, like with solar and also with wind. And the problem is very often our price for electrical power goes into negative. So sometimes there are just times we have to get rid of our electrical power, and very often we sell it to the Austrians. I mean, we sell it and we give them money, on top. And then the next day, when there is no wind and when there is no sun, we're going to buy it back. This is a bit crazy, maybe. But what I want to say is that already today we have hours, and it is increasing year by year. As soon as you increase your renewable capacities, the situation will come always. It will come more often, that you have too much electrical power. And what to do with this? This is exactly the question. What to do with the electrical power? Is it a good decision to turn down a windmill? No, probably not. Is it a good thing to sell electrical power to other countries for negative prices? No, it's probably not a good thing. So we should ask ourselves, what do we want to do with it? And I mean, we in Germany, we have the problem already now because we have a lot of renewable capacities installed already. But the rest of Europe will also. The rest of Europe also has renewable capacities already, and they will increase, and we will have the same problem all over Europe, that our renewable capacities will lead to a very volatile pricing, like from very high prices to negative prices at the same time. And then I believe then it makes sense to use electrical power when electrical power is cheap, to go for electrolysis, to go for CO2 air capture, and to go for synthetic fuels.
Let's take some questions from the audience. We've had a lot of questions come in. Thanks everybody for submitting those. Keep submitting your questions and I can read them out to the panelists. Okay, so the first question is for Andreas. It comes from Panagiotis Varelis. He says, social acceptance is one measure that is really important when introducing a new technology. In some regions of Europe, the levels of social acceptance are really low. How can we convince citizens to accept renewable technologies, and how should the additional cost be distributed between the investor, the states, and the citizens?
This is a very interesting question, because let's face it, a project like the European Green Deal will only work if people feel that it is also part of them, that they have the will to contribute. And I know that we have some areas in the European Union where the acceptance very often is very low. But maybe we should ask ourselves the question, why is the acceptance so low? And I believe one reason might be that politics is always coming up with new ideas, and one day this is good, and the next day this is good, and nobody really knows what's going on. I believe this is what Luis and John already mentioned before, that politics sometimes, unfortunately, is not very, very reliable. So what we have to do is we have to go for a framework. And as I already mentioned before, I believe that the ETS is the CO2 trading system for CO2 is a very, very good tool. We already got it in industry, for example. We already got it when it comes to electricity generation. And here we can see that this tool is working. So, and then we can ask ourselves the question, what to do with all the money which is gained by selling ETS certificates. Then we can talk about, is there a possibility to support people that we say, okay, we have to give back money to the people. This could be a really, really good tool. But as I said, this is technology neutral. And I believe this is so important. And I believe that every person in the European Union should be interested that we go for technological neutrality, because technological neutrality means that I get the cheapest and the best solution and not something somebody made up. So this is what I would like to say. We have to go for a framework. And when we go for a framework, we have cheap solutions, and maybe over the ETS, it is even possible to give back money to people or to areas or to whatever.
Luis, let me put the same question to you. How important is social acceptance in this equation?
Well, it's social acceptance is critical, because at the end of the day, from a company point of view, the citizen is the customer. So definitely we need them to understand what we are selling and understand the benefits or the drawbacks of any of the energy options that we are offering them as compared with others. Then the ideal world would be that described by Andreas. At the end of the day, if we put a price to the CO2 emissions, every ton of CO2 has a price, then the most efficient solution would gain the benefit of the consumer and of the market, because you commented before who has to pay that. At the end of the day, is the citizen and the customer who will pay everything, because at the end of the day, they pay taxes and they consume the energy goods. So definitely what I see is the importance of putting an explicit, as much as possible, explicit price of CO2. Sometimes this is complicated, and maybe there is a need of segmenting by sector, because not all the sectors consume the energy the same way, not all the options are the same. But I believe that there is ways of finding in the regulation a way of having the price of CO2 as explicit as possible, because the consumer needs to understand if he's consuming e-fuel, if he's consuming hydrogen, if he's consuming electricity in an electric car, which is the relative cost of abatement of all these options. And they probably would be in better position of understanding and getting a social acceptance for the most, let's say, for the most favorable technology options. So this is the example with e-fuels that you mentioned before. I mean, it is interesting to say, to see this reasoning of saying this is too costly, then it shouldn't be existing. No, if it's too costly, leave the companies and leave the entrepreneurs to bet for that if they believe that they can reduce the costs with time. For instance, Repsol has recently spent 60 million euros in an e-fuels plant. It's a semi-commercial one in one of our refineries, capturing CO2 from our refinery and producing green hydrogen and producing the liquid fuel. Well, we are betting on something that we don't know whether or not this will be cheaper in the future, but we would like to take that risk. So if this product is not competitive with the electric car, I don't know why there is so much emphasis on saying, okay, e-fuels shouldn't be credited in the emissions of cars because it's too expensive. If it's too expensive, the car manufacturers will build electric cars. They will not buy credits from e-fuels producers. So I believe things in some way sometimes are simpler than we would like to say.
John, the next question from the audience is for you. It's from an anonymous questioner. Why is the contribution of low carbon fuels not taking into account in the CO2 emission standards of cars? So again, why is the contribution of low carbon fuels not taken into account in the CO2 emission standards for cars?
Well, that's a very good question. And I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember the evolution of the vehicle standards from quite early days. Vehicle emission standards in the first place were designed to measure urban and suburban pollution for air quality. And CO2 wasn't in the regulations at all. Actually, CO2 was originally added so that you could calculate the fuel economy and calculate and quote to the customers the fuel economy from the CO2. And of course, there was no such thing as an electric car on the market in those days. And so and also there was really almost no biofuels as well. So the CO2 you knew was from the fossil petroleum, and you could make a calculation for the fuel economy. As we developed a standard for CO2 performance of vehicles, that test cycle and methodology has simply been extended. And we have got to the point today where vehicles are regulated with that standard, fuels are regulated with another standard. But in fact, we have very different methodology for different carbon-related policy. Now we are talking about increasing the amount of renewables under the Renewable Energy Directive. We've heard rumored numbers of the order of 24, even 26% by 2030. That means the fuel that customers buy is no longer 100% petroleum. A significant portion of it will be biogenic. So it is strange, and it's just, in our view, an anomaly with historical roots that is long overdue for being corrected. That anomaly meaning that the test cannot recognize biogenic or captured carbon. Strangely, if you look at another methodology of the EU, that for ETS, for power plants, or for industry, if you put biomass into your power plant, it's immediately rated as zero emission. So you can put one set of biomass into a power plant to make electricity and put that electricity into an electric car, and it's called zero. If you put the same biomass to make advanced biofuels, for example, and you put that into a car, it's described by the car test as 100% fossil fuel. Something doesn't add up there. We think it's long overdue to review the vehicle CO2 methodology to recognize renewable fuels.
I see Andreas nodding there, so I think he agrees with you on that. So we have a next question, thumbs up. So we have a next question, another anonymous question. This is for Luis. If e-fuels are needed now to support the transition of mobility to electric vehicles, and that unfortunately cost competitiveness of these technologies is far away in time, how do we reconcile these two elements?
Well, I would say that the case of e-fuels is not different or significantly different from other technologies that as of today, they are not mature. If you forget about the price of CO2, I believe that well, hydrogen is more expensive today than any other. The green hydrogen is much more expensive than the blue hydrogen, and the blue hydrogen much more expensive than the gray hydrogen, which is produced today from natural gas. So it's interesting to me, and again, I am speaking from a company which we are investing in electric recharge. We have a plan for 2 years to have 1 point of recharge in Spain every 50 kilometers along the main corridors of Spain. So we are not negative about the electric car. We are very positive both about electric cars and decarbonized options of the internal combustion engine. So e-fuels is today very costly, but we are betting that with lower prices of electricity and with the development of technology, eventually, by the end of the century, this may become competitive. We are not sure, but we would like to bet and explore that option. That's why we have invested in a demo plant for the time being. But the same is for hydrogen today. Nobody can build a green hydrogen plant that produces hydrogen as cheap as today's ways of producing. This is the fate of new technology. And again, we should be speaking more. Of course, it's good to have, let's say, public support to R&D, to innovation. This is well established in the European Union and very well done. But let's put a framework, as Andreas was saying, and leave the technologies to compete or complement each other. And companies need to embrace technology risk and market risk. It looks like certain segments of this energy industry, they are more used to live about tariffs and subsidies and so on. I believe there is another different way of working.
So Andreas, we have another question for you. This comes from Francesco Paolo Forina. Andreas, what are your thoughts with regards to a border carbon tax adjustment system in combination with the European ETS? My take is that without the former, the latter will only hit the competitiveness of European industries, with the result of importing the same products from regions that do not have the same regulations or targets when it comes to emissions. And the result is the undesired transfer of emissions from Europe to other parts of the world. Of course, when we're talking about any type of strategy for liquid fuels, I think this carbon border tax adjustment mechanism will be a big question. What's your take on it?
So first of all, I really believe this is a good question, and I really believe it is good also because half of the explanation already came with the question. So first of all, just because you said it's a carbon border tax, no, it is not. What we are talking about is a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It is not a tax. Why is there a difference? I believe that this dynamic pricing we have, for example, in the ETS is something good. If politics is going for a tax, the problem is always, if the tax is too high, then you will basically kill trade or you will kill industry or whatever. If the price is too low, everybody's just paying it and nothing happens. So what we talk about is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a CBAM. And to be honest, to go for a European-wide CBAM on one hand is important because we want to prevent carbon leakage. We want to prevent that CO2 intensive productions go to third countries. Because, then we destroy jobs in the European Union. And at the same time, we do not help the worldwide climate, because it's a worldwide thing we have to fight. And so I believe that a carbon border adjustment mechanism could be important. It is a problem that we should go for, and we have to seek for WTO conformity, which is not easy to do. So my proposal on this is, and it has always been, we should just grab like one or two sectors, and we should make our experiences with carbon border adjustment. And then we can, after we learned, we can extend it and we can make it bigger. That we have to go for something which prevents carbon leakage is completely clear. And now my last point. Why I know there are a lot of problems with CBAM, but there is one reason why I really have to say I like it. Because a carbon border adjustment mechanism can be understood for third countries to contribute in our ETS. So because it is completely clear, if somebody contributes in our ETS, then he doesn't have to pay carbon border adjustment if he exports things to the European Union. And so I believe maybe this is the most important reason why a carbon border adjustment mechanism can be so interesting. It should be understood as an invitation and this would be great. I mean, listen, I mean, now the relationship to the United States got a bit better. If we now find other allies, just working together with us on a common ETS. I mean, I don't want to mention the word worldwide. I mean, this would be the dream, But so let's understand the carbon border adjustment mechanism also as an invitation. And so after all, I believe this might be a good direction to go.
John, we have a next question for you. This is from Pablo Matas. What is the rationale of many politicians who are paying attention only to tail emissions and ignoring full carbon footprint? Is it just because it is difficult to be understood by the average citizen? Or maybe they think the best way to decarbonize quicker is to get rid of the liquid fuel sector altogether? John, what's your response to that?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Pablo. Well, it's partly in the answer that I've given so far, but I think let's be clear. I mean, reaching climate neutral economy for all of Europe is an enormous objective that the Commission are trying to design for, and they are looking for simplicity. And it's clear that one of the areas where they've simplified is to say, well, it looks like most or all road transport can go to electricity, and so why don't we just make that choice now? And if you make that choice, there's no reason to change the vehicle regulation. Well, I can understand that temptation when you're doing the modeling, but I think already we can see that, first of all, full electrification will have some challenges for parts of road transport, and that there are uncertainties as to how fast you can go with electrification, availability of resources, availability of battery recycling, and social acceptance in a number of areas. And for sure, aviation and maritime, you're going to need molecular fuels. And so our whole point here is that having a number of policies that support renewable fuels can actually help you create the scale longer term, and that the vehicle regulation is an obstacle to that. Because here, and this is just going to take an extra minute or so, I think we've got an emerging principle in the decarbonisation of many industries that you need a combination of push and pull mechanisms. Push to push industry to make it, pull to encourage customers to pull those onto the market and to buy them. And you've got a good example with the electric car, where the manufacturers are obligated to reach very low CO2 numbers for their fleet. So that pushes them to make the cars. But then at the customer level, there's many reasons why a customer will say, oh, I like the idea of an electric car. I pay no vehicle tax. I pay no business car tax. I pay no tax on the energy. I get a grant for buying that car. It's a set of pull measures, and it gets you there. But the problem we see is that when you come to renewable fuels, every definition in the customer's mind of low carbon transport is defined by the vehicle number. It's a 0 gram vehicle. And that number that is attached to the vehicle is defined by the test. So all roads in this argument lead you back to the vehicle test is at fault, because it prevents the customer seeing any benefit from having renewable fuels in their vehicle. So it can be done. I mean, we've actually put methodology out there for how a contract for renewable fuels can be attached to a vehicle. And then that vehicle could benefit from some kind of pull measures so that the customer says, I want to do that. I want to put my money into renewable fuels, and that'll help build the scale. But it's a dialogue that we have to have with governments and the European Commission to find a way to make that change possible.
So I want to take a last concluding question here that I'm going to put to all three of you, because I think it works well as kind of a big picture question. So this is from an anonymous questioner. Are e-fuels a solution for the transition to electromobility, or a solution for tomorrow, as you indicate? This is contradictory. So are the purpose here of e-fuels in order to get us to complete electromobility, or are they a goal in and of themselves? John, first you.
Both. We have customers that come to our stations every day with vehicles that may be €2,000 vehicles. It's going to be a long time before they buy an electric car and have that as their main business vehicle or family vehicle. We need to offer them something as well as a solution to have participation in this. And also through doing that, we can also build scale for major use in aviation and maritime and some road transport 20, 30 years from now. We should have a strategy to do both. Thanks.
Luis, same question. Are e-fuels a goal in and of themselves, or are they meant as a transition to electromobility?
Well, I would extend my answer because I would agree with John, and that's it. But I would extend my answer to renewable fuels in general. I would say advanced biofuels and so on. And I believe the key point is that there is no regret regulation. I mean, either is a short to mid-term and then disappears for light-duty vehicles at the road, and then transitioning to be part of the future of aviation, shipping, etc. That's okay. Whether along the way we see that there is residual biomass enough, and then e-fuels can become to the scene, and then they can perpetuate in some way the internal combustion engine, provided that there is zero emissions there. I believe this is also a no-regret choice. So at some point in time, it looks like the regulators are afraid of maintaining the internal combustion engine because of can perpetuate, let's say, oil and so on. It's not the case. I mean, put the regulation in place and there is no regret solution. I mean, either it's transitionary or it's perpetuating for road transport in certain segments. There is no issue provided it's zero emissions.
Andreas, same question for you. Are e-fuels the fuel of the future or a transition fuel?
So I believe that a good and fair competition makes technology better. This is what I believe. And after all, I believe that we will need different solutions in different sectors for the future. And so in my belief, liquid fuels make two things. First, it's a goal in itself. Second, it also makes e-mobility better because it has a competition. So I believe both is the case. And I believe it's not contradictory to say both is right.
I think we have time for one more question. This one has come in for Luis. Right, so this question for you, Luis, comes from Konstantinos P. Panis. Hi, Luis, do you think that the CO2 cost should be passed to the final consumers? And if no, how would Repsol compete against imports from countries that have refineries with no CO2 costs?
Yeah, definitely the European refiners and the European fuel manufacturers cannot compete long-term if there is a cost imposed in Europe and the cost is not cost of CO2 and the cost is not borne in other parts of the world that they are exporting products to Europe. So that's why the carbon border adjustment mechanism commented by Andreas is so important. So on that would be basically my answer to the question. On the other side, the price of CO2 under these circumstances, and I believe this is good to know, is going to be paid eventually by the consumer or the taxpayer via taxes or via, let's say, price of goods pre-tax. And this is how the world works everywhere. So I believe that the consciousness about the cost of goods and the cost of CO2 associated to the fuels is important to be transparent and to be fully known by the one that is going to pay for that.
So I think we have time for one more question. We've had a bunch of questions come in at the last moment here. Glad we can fit these in. This is from an anonymous questioner, Andreas. It's for you. So the German government is worried about the social impact of the transition in mobility. It is likely to be associated with quite some job losses, in particular because car makers are also relocating to Asia to build the electric vehicles. What's your take on that?
So what really worries me is that some car manufacturers, they don't only relocate to Asia when it comes to electric mobility, but that they also relocate to Asia when it comes to combustion engines. This is what really worries me. Of course, the social impact in Germany would be huge on one hand, but not only for Germany. I mean, let's maybe not only see it from the company side. Let's also see it from the consumer side. We have a huge existing fleet. What to do with those cars if we don't allow CO2 neutral liquid fuels to be in the market? I mean, this would be a catastrophe. So, and because of that, I always say, as I already mentioned several times before, let's go for technological neutrality. I cannot promise. Hello, I'm a surgeon. You know, if you have a fractured bone, you can come and visit, and then I'm the expert, and then I can tell. But here we have to talk about science. We have to talk to universities. We have to talk to scientists. We have to R&D. I'm sorry, I was losing the word, departments in the companies. This is so important. I can't tell that synthetic fuels or liquid fuels, if they are part of the future. All I say is they have a chance to be that, and they should prove themselves. And we as politicians, we shouldn't forbid that. So, as I say, technological neutrality is the best we can do probably right now.
John, did you want to respond to that as well?
Well, yes. I mean, for sure, there's a job story around this as well. And Andreas, you've already talked about the internal combustion engine. The world will have 1 billion internal combustion engines at least in 2050, I'm sure. Europe leads on efficient and very clean internal combustion engines. I'm not sure why we would want to give that up so readily, especially when there is a route for them to be climate neutral in the long run. But there's also a job story around this that didn't really come out in this conversation. Building the supply chain for the feedstocks means aggregating from agriculture and forestry and industry a wide, diverse source of feedstocks and doing some pre-processing around that. And for sure, there's a job story around that because we're creating a new supply chain that today doesn't exist. And we'd like to be able to talk about that in the future, but there's no doubt many thousands of jobs that will be created by building this new industry about low carbon liquid fuels.
Thank you, John, and thank you to all three of our panelists for some fantastic insights there. Today we were really talking about politics and policy, and tomorrow's webinar is going to be very different. It's going to be focused on the science and the technology. So that's going to happen at 12 o'clock tomorrow for the webinar, The Science and Technologies Behind Low Carbon Liquid Fuels. So it'll be a big change of pace from today. We're really going to dive into the technical details and the nitty-gritty, which I know a lot of you out there love. So I'm looking forward to that. So thanks again to our panelists. Thank you for following along at home and asking some great questions. And we'll see you back tomorrow for the next series, for the next edition of this webinar series. Have a good afternoon.